Hey everybody, welcome. I'm Steve Matthes for RacerX Films and Pulp MX, and we're sitting right here at the Honda warehouse in Torrance, California to talk about some really cool bikes and some real cool history of American Honda. And there's nobody I'd rather have here to talk about that than a guy who was a race team mechanic and a team manager for Honda Racing for a long time. AMA Hall of Famer, also, Dave Arnold. What's up, Dave? Thanks for coming by.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
This is pretty cool. Thank you for doing this. These bikes here, they represent the pinnacle of racing. They're some of the coolest motorcycles ever made. And Dave, you were a part of these things from start to finish. And I mean, I guess mid 70s to mid 90s, you were involved in the Big Red Machine.
Yeah, I just thought that's the way it always supposed to be at a motorcycle manufacturer, but then you look back and that was a pretty special period.
It was, of course, and now we have the production rule, of course, and we'll get into that a little bit, but some of these bikes are one-offs and handmades and everything else, and you're a big part of them. I guess let's go through the bikes. Let's talk about the years. Let's talk about the racing, some of the iconic riders that have ridden these machines. And we'll start with, I guess, the Gary Jones bike, first of all. What's so special about the Gary Jones machine?
Well, I think in the early 70s, the Japanese, I mean, the sport was mainly a European sport coming to the United States, and it was mainly European brand. It was Husqvarna and CZ and Mako and Bultaco and Osa and brands like that. And so when the Japanese got involved, you know, I think quality and availability was one thing, but I think they focused on lightweight as probably the biggest objective. And I hear most of this from Roger because work Suzuki's in Europe. They were super lightweight, and he also said the carburation was superior than the Mikuni compared to the Jikoff that he had on his CZ. So probably those two things.
Right, and Gary Jones is a three-time champion in the 250 class as well for Honda guys. You were working with a young rider from San Diego named Marty Smith, and incredibly, you guys did the Motocross series. Think about this: the AMA Motocross series and the 125 GPs in Europe at the same time. And you were the mechanic and responsible for the machines. We've got one here. Talk about this one a little bit.
Yeah, so actually that year you're talking about, that was in '76. Marty won the championship with a different mechanic, John Rosensteel, in '74 and '75. I think that was the first 2 years of the 125 Nationals. And that bike was just lightweight, again, and the production bike that eventually came out was just a piston port engine. That engine actually has a case reed. I think Suzuki came out with it years later, but it's got the intake track. It's a piston port and it's a case reed, but mainly just kind of lightweight and pretty damn fast, I think, was the focus of the engineering of that particular bike.
It was the beginning of the dominant Elsinore run, right, of Honda production motorcycles. And I mean, if you look back now, those bikes kind of changed the sport, didn't they?
Yeah, I think, and you know, of course, I'm not the marketing guy, but I think they made a lot of Elsinores, and I think up until that point, you know, European bikes or European motocross bikes, they're pretty expensive and probably not quite as durable as a lot of the, you know, as what, let's say, Honda focused on. When they came out with the Elsinore, they made a lot of them. They were readily available, and they already had a dealer network that was just everywhere. So
when you're working with Marty and now you're a factory Honda mechanic, the big advances, and correct me if I'm wrong, the big advances are suspension and trying to get more travel, trying to get a better stroke, trying to get the bike to handle a little bit better. You're moving the shocks around, right? You're getting some parts from Japan. What are some of the advantages on the chassis side / suspension side that you think that you and Marty are seeing is working for you?
Well, when you say, I mean, in the 70s, the advancements were just huge. I mean, a lot of there was just so much development to be had, whether it was engine rideability but also chassis. At first it was long travel. Once you had lightweight, then there was the monoshock, and it was long travel. Then everybody was scrambling, moving their suspension pivot points for the shock, trying to get additional suspension travel. Once we got travel, we created heat on the suspension component. Then there was decarbone, separating the gas and the oil. And then after that, it was the cartridge forks. And after we got travel, and that's easy to say, but it took years. I mean, that was probably a 5, 6, 7, 8 year period. Engineers, you don't just put long suspension components on an existing chassis from the early 70s. You know, you have to re-engineer the engine and how compact countershaft sprockets are to swing arm pivots. But once we got long travel, then the riders want increased progressivity, or then they want it.
Yeah.
They want the best of both.
Right.
Long travel is great, but they want it to be. They wanted to hook up and be compliant, and they want a lot of control for G-force. So
Yep.
that was more 80 and early 80s. We got into progressivity.
Yeah, and at some point we go from dual shocks to a single shock, of course, what we see today. That must have been a big change as well. What were the benefits of doing that, and were there any drawbacks to that? I mean, I would imagine lighter weight, and you can make a bigger shock shaft, which would work a little better, but were there any drawbacks or anything that guys didn't like?
There's no drawbacks.
No, okay, no drawbacks at all.
No, I mean, there's a whole bunch of benefits to when all the motorcycle manufacturers went to a single shock design. One, it was incorporated at the same time they were engineering progressive linkage systems, but having the shock and the spring and everything, there's a term called mass centralization where you want most of your weight toward the center of gravity. And so the shock and not only just the shock, but the main frame structure supported the suspension system. So then, your airbox and subframes, those things become lighter. They become, the whole bike just became a better design in my opinion.
So
More durable.
You're doing the
overall lighter
GPs.
weight.
You're doing the GPs and the AMA motocross with Marty. Same bike, different bikes. Obviously, the works rule is out there. Is it the same exact thing on both sides? Are you learning from one continent to the next on what maybe could work for both sides?
Well, so you're talking about in '76.
Yeah.
So I was Marty's mechanic here in the States,
Yeah.
and they started out being somewhat the same bike. It was basically similar to the 74, 75 championship bikes with a little bit more travel. They also started to develop a reed valve cylinder as opposed to the case reed that we previously had. So, but we were behind the ball at that point in time. Monoshock Hanna started to dominate here in the States, and then when Marty went to Europe, Gaston-Rayeur and Suzuki, both of those companies had been developing their hardware in the Grand Prix, and Honda was selling Elsinores for motocross tracks in the States, but if you go to Saddleback or Carlsbad, they weren't real rough tracks. They were, I would call them more scrambles tracks, not big jumps, not big bumps. So, but going into '76, we were behind, so they had to develop a new series, kind of their response to Yamaha's monoshock. They developed this bike called the Type 2. Pierre Carsmakers was hired to help them with a lot of the development. He went back and forth to Japan quite a bit. At first, they made a 400. I think Pierre might have raced it in the Trans Am late '75. But then in '76, we got the 125, but it was mid-season. So when you ask same bike, everything was evolving. And there was also a hiccup with claiming rules. So even when we started racing the Type 2, then somebody tried to claim it, and then Honda freaked out and pulled the bike, and then we were racing the old bike, and so it was a messed up year. We probably raced 3 or 4 bikes in that series.
Yeah, really. So you're a race mechanic at this point. You would go on to be a central figure and as a manager and have direct communications with Japan. I don't imagine at this point, working for Marty in '76, you're not having direct communication too much with Japan, right? You have a manager and that they're handling it. How much are you, but I'm wondering, from your sense of speaking about it, you talk about the Ray Hare bike, the Suzuki's, and the monoshock, and Bob's bike. Are you getting the sense that Honda is ramping up, let's say, or developing, with Carsmakers' help, developing some really good motorcycles at this point? And we'll get to the dominant ones, but at this point, are you thinking, can you see Honda being like really aggressive in racing?
In the '70s, I would say that there was sparks of brilliance. I mean, there were some bikes that people collect, let's say the Type 2s or some of the early, like you say, the Jones bike, the Smith bike, and in each era, they were beautiful, magnesium castings and the craftsmanships for the frames, and there was, but I think it was, again, the advancements were so big. Honda was strong for 2 or 3 years, and then Yamaha was strong for probably 4 or 5 years, and then Suzuki would come with the full floater. But to answer your question, was engineering a full-time occupation in the motocross era in the '70s? I don't think it was. I think it was spotted It was more of a reaction that, okay, it's the end of the year, we got to design the new bikes. We either have time or we're gonna, some of this stuff was subbed out to a company called Mugen, which was Soichiro Honda's son, Hirotoshi, and then they would build some of them, R&D would build some of them, and it wasn't really until 1980 that Honda decided to give this thing a lot of attention.
So they go and hire Roger Decoster at some point, right? They a multi-time world champion. They get him on over, and is Roger coming over and being like, hey, how much of a help is Roger in developing and pushing the racing agenda for Honda, which we see behind us through?
Roger, that was one part. You know, they probably had a strategy of engineers, and they had budget, there's a thing called LPL in Japan, large project leader. That's the head dude. So there was Soichiro Honda, and then there was a LPL at HRC, Miyakoshi, who had hired Roger, and so he's got budget, and he's got engineers, and he's got some kind of a structure to, you know, try to get ahead of this thing as opposed to following the deal, you know. And but Roger, you know, this guy respected Roger. Roger had a lot of experience from racing and development. I think he's got a pretty good balance of how much is hardware, how much is rider. I mean, it takes a lot to win. It takes hardware and, you know, the atmosphere to keep riders focused too and motivated.
Sure.
But Roger had Japan's ear, and you know, the whole team was out there testing and trying to evolve the bikes, even in the early 80s when we didn't have any of the top riders yet. I mean, Howerton was at, I think, Suzuki at this point. Bob was still at Yamaha. Barnett was at Suzuki. I mean, you know, Honda really was, I mean, we were working on stuff. They had hired Roger, but for riders, we really were playing catch up. But we did a lot of testing. We had fab shops. We had frame fixtures. We would cut things up and change. We started to, you know, we did a lot of development our own self here in the States that led to some of the exotic stuff that, you know, came back from Japan in 82, 83, 84, so.
Now, you're legendary for your knowledge in chassis and suspension. You've helped out a lot of teams. You still help people out to this day in 2021. Are you, as a young Dave Arnold, are you starting you're leading that path as a mechanic? You're more interested in that than motor development? You're more interested in seeing how a bike can handle better and what you can do? We talked about moving shocks and things. Is that where your interest starts coming into play here?
Yeah, I would say yes. I've always fascinated with, I mean, even from dirt track racing, you know, wire building. I mean, in dirt track racing, everybody raced British bikes at the time, and then they would aftermarket, you know, Redline and Champion and C&J and all these people. Why are they doing that? What are they changing? Is it just for weight? And then as motocross started to evolve, I mean, it's just making bikes go over bumps, you know. So and there was a guy I ran into, helped with fabrication, Bruce Burness. He worked for S&W in the mid 70s. Later on, he worked for Olean Shocks. Him and I became really good friends, and he was really good with suspension, but he also taught me a lot in more the dynamics, you know, not really a theoretical guy, more of a conceptual guy. Like, you know, you've heard things.
If you move this, you got to move this.
It was almost like, you know, I have a problem with my rear suspension, but his automatic response might have been, yeah, but what's the front, you know? Yeah. And then you start thinking at things, you know, everything on a motorcycle is so interdependent, you know? Mm-hmm. So it's almost never just the shock, or it's almost never just the chassis. It's how all these things work together. Yeah. So I got fascinated with it. In the 70s, I think like a lot of people involved in the sport, because, you know, we were in the infant stages, and how do you get travel? You see people doing it 10 different ways by cutting the frame and lengthening the shock or moving the shock mounts. And then once we did that with the rear suspension, then you make a longer fork. Well, then now you don't have fork overlap, and the forks are twisty and it's unstable. Then you got to develop front suspension at the same time, and then and then engineers had to go back and repackage the motor and put the countershaft sprocket close to the swing arm pivot. So yeah, I was always fascinated with that. And also within Honda, you know, the deeper I got into chassis design or development, you know, Honda, it's Honda Motor Company. You know, they were pretty solid, and they were pretty proud of their capability for engine development. But a lot of this goes way back even into road racing. I would say that they never really looked at the chassis design or the portion of the, the development as seriously as they did the engine. I'm not bagging on them. It's just kind of a dynamic that was hard to nail down, where motor is more of a pure science. I think they can measure it, and they can see dyno curves, and they can look at acceleration. They can, chassis,
A little bit of a black art.
Yeah, it's a bit of a black art. So
Right.
I think Honda is very much a company of pure engineering, and sometimes pure engineering has a hard time understanding things that are subjective or dynamic.
So one of the things we have here, of course, talking about engineering and talking about innovation and Honda and everything else. One of the bikes we have here is it's a Ribi forked bike. Is that saying it right?
Yeah,
Ribi.
Ribi. The guy's name Ribi Valentino.
So that's an 81 chassis or an 81 model, or what is? Explain this Ribi bike to us and take us through this thing. What the genesis of it, how it works, how Donnie Hansen raced it. Talk about that a little bit.
So it goes before Honda, I think. If you look at pictures of Roger's last year racing Suzuki, there's a design of a Ribi fork. Yeah. Roger, and it's a steel. It's not, the ones you see on the Hondas are built at aluminum, but it's a steel. I used to call them leading link fork, but they're not really. They're more complicated than a leading link fork. But Roger used it, and Roger tells me that one main reason that he ended up using this fork after trying it and working with Ribi to develop it was he had been hit in the shoulder. I think it was at Lommel, but they have lanes of the track going one way and lanes going the other way, and somebody crashed and a bike hit him in the shoulder and ripped him off the bike and kind of gave him a shoulder injury that didn't heal right away. It probably still hurts to this day. And he said when he rode with the Ribi fork, it didn't leverage his upper body or require the same upper body strength, and it made it a little bit easier on his shoulder. But back to the reason that Ribi developed that fork was wheel trajectory. He just didn't like that on motocross bikes. Now you got longer travel, and when you compress the front fork and you transfer all this weight, the actual wheelbase is getting shorter in the front, and your rake and trail and all those things are, in his mind, changing too aggressively. So he developed this linkage fork for, the wheel path. You hear a lot about this in the bicycle industry from virtual pivots, and it's almost the same discussion that he just wanted preferred. But it wasn't just, it was wheel trajectory. You could change and control your anti-dive with that front fork. It had increased levels of torsional rigidity. It wouldn't twist. I mean, forks were 35 millimeter diameter in the early 70s, and then they were 38 and 39 and 40, 41. But you still, up until upside down forks, you still kind of had a problem with twist and those forks. And a third thing that they brought was, we also had been doing in the mid 70s, increasing suspension travel and putting so much focus on the rear suspension and the shocks, separating the air and the oil and decarbone, and then the front fork used rear shocks. And so even the level of hydraulic control the Ribi fork had was superior, even just because of the sophistication of the shock absorber.
Right. So what was this bike? Was it a prototype that Roger developed for the riders to test it out? How close did this ever come to being put on a works bike? Do you know?
Yes, probably some bean counter could answer that better than myself. But that fork was so when Roger agreed to come to HRC, agreed to switch from Suzuki to Honda. He had a lot of faith in that fork. He had a lot of faith in this engineer, Ribi Valentino, and I think he asked HRC if they would research that technology and try to further develop it. And I think they made some kind of a licensing agreement between HRC and Ribi Valentino, and there was a few designs that he had that I think HRC looked at, and they worked on that fork a lot. At first, it has a lot of qualities. I mean, you could drive a motorcycle into a curb with that front end, and it would go over like no other telescopic fork at the time would. But it did have a heavier feel to it because of the inertia. And so they tried to take the suspension component, the shock. Originally there was 2 shocks. It was a little bit heavy overall too. Yep. The one Honda here has at the collection, they put the shock behind the number plate with some link bars. Eventually they put the shock on the frame in a couple different locations. But I think the engineers in Japan ultimately learned that probably the biggest advantage was the hydraulics itself. And then I think they put more time and energy just into developing the cartridge fork, which ultimately, probably another thing with the Ribi fork, I can imagine in production, it would be a very expensive system. Yeah. I believe I heard that, but I don't know that for a fact.
And Donnie Hansen did race with this fork.
Yeah, I believe. Yeah, he did race. Yeah,
and that's pretty cool for sure.
Yeah, that thing looked like a pretty exotic kind of a something from outer space at the time.
Yeah, really, right?
It wasn't even just the fork. When you saw that fork, even with the first Hondas with linkage rear suspension, and water cooling, I think at the same time, you're like, what the hell is that? So.
The next bike we have here, Daryl Schultz's 1982 bike. He won the championship on this bike. It has number 1 on it because it was raced at the Motocross of Nations. Famously, another Team USA win, an incredible Team USA win. This bike has a one-piece subframe / airbox. What else, Dave, from this bike captures your eye, and what makes this thing so special?
Daryl's bike, all the bikes in 82, I think that, our team had done a lot of the prototyping in, let's say 80 and 81, and then some of those things were starting to come to fruition in 82. And also Honda HRC, they were getting their engineers spooled up, and the team, our team at American Honda, we didn't win any of the nationals or Supercross championships in 81, but at the end of the year we went to Europe with an all Honda team for Motocross of Nations, kind of a big upset, and we won. So once we won, that sort of got the attention of Japan. They thought we were not a joke, but they weren't going to work real hard if you didn't have anybody that was going to do anything with it. And so once the team won that world championship, we started getting a little bit more interest, a little bit more respect, mutual respect with Japan. And the bikes that we had in 82 were just all 3 of them, but especially the 250 for Supercross. Donnie Hansen won. Probably getting ahead of myself, you'll ask me, but he won Supercross title, 250 National, but the same bike, although it was air-cooled, Daryl Schultz won the 500 class. But I also believe that in 82, that bike you're talking about, they were just developing the full, it's a 498, the full displacement 500 two-stroke. That was the first time that, they raced that. And that monocoque airbox came from the 250 Supercross bike, and they were just able to make a lightweight tail section, maximize airbox volume, and it was just a good design for that period of time.
So it wasn't so much, I guess it was performance and weight reasons for that.
It was
compete,
both
right?
engine performance and weight. Yeah.
When you look at that was a great year, absolutely. It's got the lower tanks. The 250s had the lower tanks for the first time. When you wheeled, are you team manager at this point?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, so when you wheeled these bikes out at Anaheim in 1982, it must have just blew everybody's minds, right?
It was impactful. I think this stuff was pretty exotic and a lot of handmade. And there was actually a fabricator at HRC, and he would, what a heliarc, right, for welding? Yeah. This guy that fabricated most of all those aluminum tanks and the tail sections, he would do them on the ground, and he would put the pedal under his butt and go bap, bap, bap with his butt on the pedal. That way he could hold the parts and tack them and weld them. And anyway, there was a lot of effort.
So he was an exotic welder also.
He was an exotic welder, yeah. No, that stuff was that in 82, there's certain years you could pick, not necessarily just because there works, even some of the production stuff, but there's certain years where, it's an advantage, the gap between what you put together, or what you had to go racing with. In 82, it was a big gap between what Honda had and some of the other manufacturers.
Absolutely. Also around this time, Dave, front suspension has cartridge forks now in 82, which is a huge step up, right?
Huge. Up until that point, I'll say it was mainly orifice dampening, which is kind of the opposite of what you like. Orifice dampening forks, it's what people think they want, but you don't really want. It moves really easy in the beginning. It's almost like slower shaft speeds, but then when you hit something like a rock or a square edge bump, it a hydraulic lock. So cartridge forks just did what we had for a rear shock in a long time. You had valving that you could get a certain amount of low speed dampening that you need for control and and then in high speed it blows off. So it was a huge development advantage over some of the other manufacturers.
So 1982, and to me, I agree as a guy from the outside, just looking at it, 1982 was the beginning of sort of the Honda run of excellence, the Honda ingenuity, the Honda technology. It begins in 82.
I agree, yeah.
Another bike we have here is, there was a one-off event at Carlsbad Raceway for a number of years called the Superbikers. And it was a mishmash of flat trackers, road racers, and motocross guys. Love to see this thing come back nowadays, by the way. This, go Google it or YouTube it, people. It's on there. You won't believe it. But this had big factory involvement for a number of years, and it was a source of pride if a motocrosser won it, or Eddie Lawson or a dirt tracker. So we have a bike here. It's an '82. It was built for Steve Matthes, who had won the event. He was the defending champion. It's got a floating rear disc on it. It's got a handmade swing arm on it, and massive discs. And the brakes, the front master cylinder looks like it's off of a Honda Civic. Talk about building this thing. And is this something where the road race community of Honda comes together with the motocross group and they build the bike, or how does this work?
Well, that event was promoted by a guy, not with us anymore, but Gavin Tripp, and he was the promoter of the Carlsbad USGP. But he had kind of a relationship with the wide world of sports, and they wanted to create an event that was the epitome, that brought all the disciplines together, so you had the dirt trackers, the motocrossers, the road racers, and then you could kind of find out, who's the best. But you can't have motocrossers go and road race, or you can't have road racers go dirt track. So they tried to come up with a formula, and that's kind of what that track, dictated by the track. And so they had, they pitched the event. Yeah. It sounds kind of exciting. It's after the season's over. Everybody's all, Roger's a racer. I'm a racer. You get all wound up to do this. But you sort of have to imagine, what's going to be effective if, yes, there's a drag strip there, but then it goes on the dirt and it's got all these dirt track turns, and then it comes and the bike we would have to base it on at Honda would have been, RC 500,
Schultz's bike, basically.
Schultz's bike. And that was the '82. That actually was the last year that we raced it. That might have been the last year they ran the event. Not quite sure, but
'84, I believe.
'84. Yeah. So the first time we raced it was in '79. And I think our bikes were 450s at the time, displacement. And we didn't have disc brakes. And so we were doing things, but the speeds, they're going 120, 130 miles an hour. Yeah. Maybe not quite as much on the 450. In '82, that was a full 498. It was fast. It was, so we had to, we had drum brakes. Well, we got to cool the brakes. We were drilling big holes in the backing plate, and it just wasn't competitive. The drum brakes were turning to powder, and the dust is flying all over the bikes. And because of the brakes mainly, we weren't competitive in '79. In '80, '81, we built a bike similar to what you see here in '82. So Steve Matthes won, which we put disc brakes on the bike. We had to float the brake on the bike because of the wheel chatter at the end of the drag strip on the asphalt.
Is this developed with the road race guys, or no? This is a motocross thing only.
No. I don't know. No, I think I just sort of
figure it out.
I just sort of had to figure it out.
Right. Hey, get a rotor off of whatever.
So how much travel? You can't. We just had a discussion about increasing suspension travel, but you don't increase suspension travel without engineering the chassis.
Doing something else.
That's considering that, right? Well, now we're going the other way. Well, how much suspension travel do you think we can get away with and not screw the chassis up? That's kind of, you can't just go from 300 down to 150, really, Yeah. So we sort of winged it on suspension travel, and we put a lot of brake on the bike because we didn't have any brake the previous year. And that '82 event, there was an engine tuner in Japan, ironically by the name of Mr. Kawasaki, and he was just making the 498s. Okay. And I think before that there was a bike called the 476. It went 450, 476, 498. And in any case, this guy making this full-size 500, he goes, "Hey, you want me to make an engine kit for that race?" I didn't even know he knew about that race. And I'm like, yeah. So they were fast. I remember that was one of my favorite races to this day to watch, because Steve Matthes was a two-time defending champion. now we had Danny Magoo Chandler.
An absolute madman.
I would call him a wild card, but you're probably, more accurate.
Yeah.
And then we had the 2 Harley guys, and those 750 XRs, they were fast. And Springer, he knows how to ride, and forget the other rider off the top of my head. Maybe you do. So it was 2 Harleys and 2 Hondas, and it was just an iconic race of on the high-speed road race course. The Harleys would get us by a bit, and then we'd get back into maneuverability, and we weren't. It's not like we had anything big on them, we just had different attributes, and a great race. And then
it's funny you say that. I worked at Yamaha for a number of years, and so Bob Oliver was a guy there that I learned a lot from. Great guy, and I could tell in talking to Bob, much like I can hear in your voice, the pride that they had because Eddie Lawson won. And so they built the YZ490 for Eddie Lawson, and they beat all the other factory guys. So, and they really worked a lot on that bike, and you could tell the pride that Bob had in helping Eddie Lawson win that event. Kind of like you with the Steve Wise, and so it did seem like this Superbikers race brought all of you factory guys out of the woodwork.
It's you have a bunch of parts in your box, but it's a clean sheet of paper.
Sure.
Like no one is giving you a floor plan as to how this thing is going to lay out. So you kind of got to imagine, well, it's this much dirt track, it's this much road race, and it's this much so here's what we need to put together. And it was everybody's best guess. Lawson was phenomenal. That might have been the first year. He was really good. Right. So Bob did a good job.
He did. I could just tell that they had pride in beating Honda and the other OEMs. Diverting a little bit from the individual bikes we have here at the Honda Museum, a couple of things. So you talk about 82 being the start of this run of excellence for Honda. As I understood it, you got the bikes built in a crate from Japan. Your works bikes were delivered to you guys in a crate, and then the mechanics would take them back apart and assemble them, lube them up, and get to know the bike well. I'm interested though, how do the riders not get to ride the 82 bike in any form until it shows up in California? Or how does the testing of a works bike go so that you guys could say, hey, lowered tank, yes or no? We don't want a disc, we want drums, or vice versa. Or does Japan say, this is what we've got, this is what we think is the ultimate race weapon, here it is? How does that process go? Can you take us through it?
I think before, at some point in the year, then there's a meeting of the minds, so you'd have the top HRC, the engineers come together, and Roger and I had really good working relationships with that group, whether we'd have to fly to Japan or they would be here for some of the races, and then there would be discussions about the evolution,
Okay, yep.
I in the design studio, I worked for a short period of time, but there was whether it's a revolution or an evolution. Revolution being super big changes, which sometimes are more theoretical in base. Engineers think, well, this would really hit it out of the park if we, or evolution's more, we got something that works pretty good. Here's our weaknesses. How do we improve on that without screwing up anything else? And so I'd say it starts with meetings and discussions and planning. And, just would be Roger and I with the engineers and the project leaders. Mm-hmm. And then I would say they put something together and they have their own test group in Japan. Sometimes it's, I guess people want to say it's not exactly the same, and it's not. I mean, Honda also has a thing that says go to the spot. So engineers have to, it's not like the Japanese really had that level of Supercross ride or even Supercross track as we do in the States. Right. So it wasn't like they could really evaluate and set up, but they weren't that bad. I mean, they rode. They were very competent. They were good at testing and kind of sorting out a lot of the hardware. And so then there would be an event. Let's say we would go at the end of the year. Toward the end of the year, we would go over for Japan Supercross, and then we'd say, okay, try this or try that.
Here's a base model or something.
Yeah, and that would still be a, they might even have a name for it, like PP1 or PP2 or
right.
I don't know. That's more for production, pre-production 1, pre-production 2, but for a race they probably have stages. Yep. And so we would go test like an early prototype. Yeah, this seems good. This seems like it still needs something different. And then it'd show up, and a lot of times with a few optional parts, if it wasn't exactly a home run the way it came, you'd have a couple optional link ratios, or sometimes even chassis geometry in the early stages, and then you would narrow that down. So.
Yeah, I've heard the mechanics wouldn't really know what they were racing until they open up that crate.
No.
And there is the bike.
And to be honest, we did a lot of R&D in racing at that time. Like it, you know, I would say that we really tried to get on top or ahead of, you know, the ball, or whatever you want to call it, the bar. And, you know, we were probably to a fault. You know, I mean, I was cutting frames up. Unfortunately, when one of my first trips to Japan, they had these beautiful frame jigs, and they were very universal. They were something I'd never even seen in the States, but they had these. They were versatile enough to where they would do the trials bikes on the same, and they would do Freddie Spencer's road racers and all the different motocross bikes with the same fixture. Of course, it was different plates and different engine mounts and everything else, you know. And I had to have one of these things, you know. I didn't know how I was going to get it, but I still have it today. So I was good friends with this chassis designer, Yasuki Surumi, and please, I beg, just give me the blueprints for that thing. And I ended up making 2 of them. One of them I had over at R&D later, and one still in racing.
Wow.
So I was...
So you were tinkering yourself, doing things.
A lot. I mean, I was, by this point in time, for better, for worse, you know, and it's not like they were all home runs. I know how to go backwards, too. And, I mean, I would just cut stuff up, and, you know, and again, it's how all these things work together, you know, and sometimes your suspension components and or settings, they have this character. So to maximize that character, you know, you need a chassis that sort of does this, and, you know, you're learning along the way. And at this point in time, now you're working with engineers that are, you know, what are your limitations? You have works regulations, your buddies with the chassis, your counterpart. And I mean, even though I was a manager, chassis sort of evolved into being pseudo kind of my thing. And, but I could change engine castings. I could, you know, you get late in the year, and then, like, I remember people ask, why did they change the chain from the right to the left? And I mean, we would do those things on a whim, you know, like we went from drum to disc brakes, and the chain had been on some of the best bikes, these 82 bikes, the chain was on the right. Then we went to disc brakes, and they did not want, of course, the brake pedal, the master cylinder on the right. Now you got the disc, you know, the drum brake is on the same side as the sprocket if you got a conical hub. Now you have a disc on the opposite side of the sprocket. So now the brake line had to cross over near the shock spring, near the linkage.
Now it got hot. Yeah.
They didn't want, and even the, maybe there was probably even the liability or durability, you know. They didn't want the hydraulic line near the shock. So, and also you can take the whole brake system on and off the bike if it's on the same side. So you see people hanging up. So, I mean, you're like talking to the engineer, well then put the countershaft sprocket on the other side. And, all right, you know, I'll go do that.
Yeah.
So
was that, what was the lead time in sort of changes like that?
Well, everybody was pretty focused on building the best stuff.
Pretty aggressive.
And I would say that things were happening at a pretty rapid pace.
Right.
I don't remember how many months, but I remember Yamaha raced a rotary valve 125 for a short period of time, and then there was I think before that Can-Am Jimmy Ellis, and those things were fast, right? So, but they had problems. They were a little wide in the intake tract, and so then Honda built a motor. They put the rotary valve on the back of the motor, and it had a mechanical centrifugal clutch on it, you know, to where it had variable timing. And anyway, it didn't work out for a few reasons. And then we had one of the top engineers of the company from HRC over here. He came over for this test. Well, after we had that test, well, let's cut it up and make a case read out of it. Okay. So then we cut and weld and bondo, and then that had some qualities too. Some of it was better, some of it maybe not. And then, but he took this whole, when he arrived, he had the most beautiful mag casting. I mean, this thing was a piece of art you would just have in you make a lamp.
When he left?
And when he left, you know, I was thinking.
Now it's a case read.
Yeah, you know, so don't go to America anymore. Those guys will screw it up, you know, so.
Can you point to any specific things that you did to any of these guys, Hansen, Bailey, O'Mara, any of these bikes that was a change that they got from Japan that you did that they immediately liked? Was there something that you could think of an example of one or two things that your R&D was put to use?
I would say that a lot of the chassis designs, let's say just geometry, and even the 82 bike, you know, when they came with the low gas tank with the vacuum pump, I thought that was indirectly or directly influenced by. So in 81, we had water-cooled bikes, we had air-cooled bikes, and you know, the water-cooled bikes ran a little bit better, but they felt a little bit heavier, they had a higher center of gravity. Ergonomically, they were not quite as good, and the riders didn't like going into a turn with radiators and shrouds, and their legs would get wider, and even some of the shrouds would catch on hay bales, or, you know. So
don't put them on the handlebars, though, Dave.
Don't
That's
put them on
not
the
a good idea.
So so about halfway through the year, and again, we weren't winning nationals at the time. You know, we had these bikes, but then I think Howerton and Hanna and Barnett and Glover, probably a few others, you know. So Johnny O'Mara and Donnie Hansen, they were getting better. They were becoming more competitive in the 125 nationals. Donnie was coming a little bit better in the, you know, instead of a distant fifth, you know, he was fifth, sixth. He was, those guys were some more in sight at the end of the races. And so I got a wild hair to just take an air-cooled bike. If they like the ergonomics of the air-cooled bike, which is on some of these, like Schultz's bike, that aluminum gas tank. So build an air-cooled bike with a water-cooled engine and lower the radiators, mainly because if you looked at Barnett's 250, they had one radiator, but it was pretty low on the bike, and he rode that thing like it was a little slot car. So we lowered the radiators. Paul Turner at the time ended up being the RockShox guy later, but he could fabricate exhaust pipes. That was a big limitation. We didn't make our own pipes, so anyway, we lowered the radiators, had to make shrouds, had to make mounts. He routed all the water lines, routed the pipe. They loved that bike, and it had a lower CG, the ergonomics were improved, it got rid of all the negatives, and it enhanced the positives. And
so they're looking at the gas tank.
I really think that when that bike went to Japan and Honda was really ramping it up for 82, then what do they say? They have a saying, if a little does a little good, a lot do a lot of good. So. So then Japan saw, well, they all like it. They lowered the center of gravity. They increased mass centralization. We'll take that to a whole new level. So I'm pretty sure that evolved from our prototype in 1981.
Wow. And when you do that in 81, do you need permission?
No. No.
It's you and Roger?
No,
and
it's mainly just me.
Yeah, okay.
No, I was the crazy guy dreaming up stuff.
Okay. Awesome.
I mean, I tried to get Roger to buy in, and Roger and I we're very much on the same page, you know. I mean, Roger, I'm not saying he's not technical, but I mean, Roger would allow me to get off in left field.
He's the rider, and
he's a rider. He'd pull me back if he thought I was lost, and you know. But no, I mean, probably the benefit of being the manager and sort of evolving into that position. I'd had all the other roles, and again, no. American Honda racing was not really a corporate activity. You know, we dealt with engineers in Japan. I mean, I had people in sales. Maybe they signed some of the checks that subsidized racing. I think there was a shared value. Marketing people, obviously they got exposure from racing. And engineering, they got some technical benefit from developments in racing. So I don't know what that balance was. Somebody else did the books. I just spent the money, you know. But nobody really. I mean, I had managers of American Honda said we don't know anything about racing. We don't want to know anything about racing. So you guys just handle it. So
sit there in your cubby hole.
For a period of time, it was like that. But toward the end of the 80s, after production regulation, Japan engineering softened a little bit, and then. You know, corporate got more involved. So
the next bike we have here, Dave, is the 84 500 of David Bailey. He wins the championship in 83, the 250 outdoor title and the 250 Supercross title. In 83, would you say this 83 bike was similar to 82? Was there a big jump for you for that year?
I got to go back and look at what an 83 is, but I think they started to mess with water cooling in 83.
Yep.
And so it was quite a bit. I mean, and there was a big thing with exhaust pipe. They still wanted to run a low tank, and the exhaust pipe volume of a 500 is quite a bit bigger than a 250. So packaging of a low gas tank, radiators, exhaust pipe, there was a lot of things to balance out.
So this 84 bike we have, he's the Grand National Champion, hence the blue number plate with the yellow number 1. He's got a big exhaust guard on it for heat, I imagine.
Yeah.
So that would have been a Cliff White special.
You know what? I'd hate to say I don't remember, but I kind of don't remember if that was Japan or Cliff. It might have been Cliff.
Right. And so in 84, David Bailey moves to the 500 class. He races the defending champion, Brock Glover, and Bailey puts a hurt on Glover. The disparity, Dave, between the 84 HRC 500 and the 84 YZ 490 that Brock Glover's racing is pretty vast.
Yeah, well, we thought so, but I never get overconfident about those things.
Right.
I mean, it still kind of comes down to a rider, you know, pulling it off. And Brock was a hell of a racer, even in spite of all that. And I believe he even won the following year. Yeah. So, you know, David was, but Dave, like, you know, you can go over all the way up until Ricky Johnson. I mean, Dave was an excellent 500 racer. There was a lot of guys like Ricky that really good 250 racer, but they used a lot more throttle and they were a little sloppier and they bounce off things. I'm not saying Ricky was sloppy, he's not, but when they got on a 500, you don't ride like that. And Bailey was really precise, and he was one of the world's best, if not.
Right.
So.
Yeah, the 84 500, this thing is starting to, again, just get into a work of art territory for Honda. And that leads us into the 1985 models. The first 1985 model I want to talk about is Bob Hanna's bike here. This is the last year of the Works bike rule. This is maybe the pinnacle of a factory bike. A tiny radiator on the left side, a bigger radiator on the right. Hanna liked the rear drum. Other guys put a rear disc on. This had the electronic power valve, Dave. It had a fuel pump on it. Take us through this 85 250.
So the 85 250 was probably one of the more expensive bikes that we ever had to purchase from Japan, and whatever that agreement is, you know, it's a bike, but it's also engineering that support and parts and things like that. But it was the year prior to production regulation in 86, so you kind of got to look at the 85 bike like it was really information gathering. I mean, yeah, it was to make an exotic race bike, but let's just take on the 250, they had power valves, a real, I think they called it HPP. They put a power valve on the 250, but it was electronically controlled with servos, and so we would have to have an engineer there with, you know, their laptop and cable and program how it was working, and, you know, program the opening and closing. It was in a constant state of tuning, refinement, even during racing, and all of that was being factored in, sent to Japan for their development of what was to be the mechanical version of the same system.
Did you know the production rule was coming in before 85, or when? Do you remember when that basis of the AMA production rule coming in?
Yeah. It's no way. 85 is way too late in the game. So we probably, you know, I know Kenny Clark was lobbying for it.
Sure.
Probably years before that.
Yeah,
I'm sure in 83. At least in 83, I probably, it was even into 82. I mean, the 82 bikes were so good that probably even after that, people were starting to make noise that, you know, we got to trim some of the exotic out of Honda's development.
So the 85, the power valve was working off a servo that would open and close at a certain RPM?
Yes.
And do you remember there being any hiccups with that, or do you remember it working pretty smoothly, or?
There's always hiccups with everything in racing, but there one hiccup I can't remember. You might have known about it, so that's why you asked me. But so Jim Felt put a brand new wire loom on his bike and cherried the bike all out before Unadilla. There was it might have been a Grand Prix.
Yep, 85 USGP.
Yeah. So in any case, everybody, you know, at Unadilla, they only ran those big races, and they didn't run a bunch of amateur races, and they let grass grow. Ward Robinson was the promoter, and so, but when the grass grows to be 2 feet high and everybody goes out on their 125, or let's say even 250, they come in and say, my bike feels slow because it's loamy dirt for, you know, 13, 14 inches deep. So Johnny O'Mara comes in and he goes, this thing just doesn't feel like it's running right, you know, and we say, no, it's just the grass. Go back out. He goes back out, he comes in, he's like, no, it's a dog on bottom and it's flat on top. So we bring the things into the pits and got the engineer with, you know, going over, In fact, it was. So something in the wire harness had been wired incorrectly. And so the exhaust valve was working exactly opposite. So it was open at low RPM
Yeah, closed at high
and
RPM.
closed at high RPM. So that was a pretty good hiccup. But no, I mean, that was, no, I mean, we never had a problem with that system in racing, no. The only thing I would say is it was a really fast bike. It felt like a really fast bike. And so the riders, you know, they were like, we've never ridden anything like this. I mean, we don't even, usually we went to, what do they call it, the California series, Golden State series to warm up and everybody kind of get the bike set up before we even start off the Supercross series. And then the riders like, these things are so good, we don't even want to show the other teams what we have, which is kind of ironic in that I'm sure it was fast, I'm sure it did feel fast, but as far as an effective race tool, and as much talent as we had on the team, we didn't really accomplish that much with that bike. I'm sure Japan got a lot of information, but David Bailey, he probably irritates him every time I mention this, but I witnessed him looping out. I've never seen riders loop out, coming out of a corner. I think it was in Atlanta, Georgia, just right before the finish line. The thing just threw him on the ground like a more of a rookie move, right? And so the championship went down to the last race at Pasadena Rose Bowl. So Lachine was still in the points.
It was 4 points back,
between Jeff Ward and Ronnie, and then he ended up throwing it away in the whoop. So it was super fast, not ultra controllable in race situations. So.
Now, this is the advent of a rear disc brake, but like as I mentioned, Hannah liked the drum, right? What do you remember about that? And the other riders picking a disc, and Hannah just being old school was like, "No, keep the 1980s drum on there."
Yeah, there was, I think disc brakes, of course, they brought more power, you know, and that's in most circumstances a good thing, but feel and controllability were always being refined. And when I say sometimes it was too much too soon, and for Bob in the front, they were able to kind of get him happy. When they were playing with like a braided line doesn't have much flex, and so it would be more abrupt, and they could play with the size of the pistons and the master cylinders and things, and even the caliper. But in the rear brake, he just did not like having that much brake, and it was more of a feel thing.
Right.
So.
The seat goes all the way up to the gas tank. Bob's seat is incredibly wide on this bike. You can see that. That's a pretty unique feature. I remember seeing photos of Lachine's bike really skinny, going all the way up to the gas tank. So there was adjustability for your seats on that.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure why it was that wide up at the gas tank. I thought it was I mean, I know there's a balance and I know there's a limit. A lot of times people think narrower and narrower is good, but you also have to kind of hold the rider in a certain place so he doesn't move too much, and maybe it serves that purpose, but.
One of the things on the 85s that I found interesting that you pointed out was they had adjustable, almost shock struts going to the steel frame, aluminum struts that the shock bolted to, and these things look really cool, Dave, but they didn't work the greatest, did they?
So, again, because 85 was the predecessor of production regulation in 86, and yes, normally we have adjustable, different linkages, so that would be the rocker and the pull rod, but this bike was designed to where even the upper shock mount, it had a billet mount to where you could move that if you wanted to, or let's say, and also the pull rod mount to the frame, all those points were adjustable. You have to make.
Which seems cool in theory.
Seems cool in theory, but it actually, when with exactly the same pivot points and the same motion ratio and the same shock settings between 84 and 85, the suspension worked terrible in 85. It was way too soft and bottomed. Nobody could understand that, so they would, rebuild the shock and firm up the setting a little bit. Still way too soft and bottom, and it ended up just being any flex that was related to those suspension hard points was a negative, and it had an adverse effect on suspension performance.
Smallest difference in material from steel to aluminum, even though it's the same dimensions and same length, same ratios, it affected the bike, did it?
Yeah, I'm not even sure the material could be part of that.
Yep.
And I'm sure it is a factor, I'm not going to say, but even if you have things precision machined and mounted with bolts, and even if you don't think there's any flex at all or any movement or any There is a little bit, and it translates into.
Would you play with swing arms around this era? Were you guys getting different lengths of swing arms? I know that's something that I've seen on other factory bikes. Would you do much of that, or would
we did a bit?
Yeah.
We did a bit,
but it wasn't something where, hey, we're going to a sand track, we're going to put a longer swing arm on,
no.
nothing like that.
No, we did a bit. I know that like the 500, like on Schultz's bike, it would have a 15 millimeter longer arm than the 250, and a lot of times we would put it on the 250 to see if that translated to a positive, and I don't think it stuck.
Right.
So
something that really came along around a little bit later than this era, but comes to mind for me, twin chamber forks. Are you starting to see this kind of technology in the mid 80s, or is that still a ways away a little bit?
No, for sure.
Okay.
They brought that. I can remember the first time we tried that was, let me think, it was, no, you're right. It wasn't in the 80s. It was 91.
Okay, so yeah.
It was 91, and it was Jeff Stanton was national number one. I have to pick the right year, so I don't know when John Michel Bale.
He won in 91, yeah.
Bale did?
91, yeah.
Yeah, so it must have been in 90.
Okay.
So Honda had a design for twin chamber fork, for obvious reasons. It kept the air separate from the oil, and also they could make a better bottoming system, which was probably the main reason. And they probably didn't pay Steve Simons for their previous bottoming system for royalties. But they came with that, and they came with a cylinder, which ended up being in production 92. It had a different exhaust valve in it. We tried that stuff at Unadilla, both of them. And they just kind of wanted, before they committed full-scale production, they wanted, Jeff to try them in racing. So.
Okay. So this 85 bike, this is, as I mentioned, this is the last year of the Works bike. Production rule is coming in. And again, you mentioned you guys didn't win in 85. It wasn't a successful year on the track. This bike was amazing. David Bailey has told me different things about it being flawed. You've mentioned it too. It's a case of almost
two trick.
Two trick, yeah. Is there such a thing, Dave?
It's a case of two trick.
Yeah.
I mean, it was over the top, and it lacks some, what do they say, practical application or controllability issues, really.
Right. The next bike we have here from 85, Dave, is Ron Lacheyne's Outdoor 125 Championship bike. Now, you did win in that class. This bike, I watched some old videos of this bike. It looks like a rocket ship compared to Suzuki's and Yamahas at that time, Dave.
It was fast.
Yep.
The 125s in that era, the ones that Mickey Diamond rode, and then the ones that Ron Lacheyne, I think this is the previous bike.
Yep.
They were really fast. We had an engine tuner, ironically, by the name of Mr. Kawasaki, and that exhaust system on that bike, it didn't have a true in-the-cylinder power valve. It had an attack system, they called it, which is a plenum chamber that changed the volume of the header pipe of the chamber, and they ran really, really good, really good.
What was the idea behind the short radiator on the left? And then you talk about mass centralization, you talk about getting the weight low, and you have a tiny radiator on the left and a long one on the right. What was the idea behind that, and did it affect the handling and the chassis at all, or obviously not? But.
So the best guy to ask that is Johnny O'Mara, because Johnny O'Mara was the 125 Honda ace for years, but the way the pipes were routed on those bikes prior to this bike you're talking about, the exhaust pipe would burn the rider's leg over and over. Weekend, he's practicing and then racing, and I think it's just the way the pipe laid out on the bike and where the midsection was, and it would cook the inside of Johnny's left leg. I'm sure if you look at his legs, I don't know if you do, but anyway, he's got a pretty good lifetime scar on the. So if they shorten the radiator up on the left side, they could keep more of the midsection of the exhaust pipe in that location as opposed to back where the rider's leg was. So it was mainly packaging and trying to save the riders.
So this is a pretty cool bike. Great story behind this. Ron really cleaned up at the Nationals. He got a flat tire in one moto. I think his cylinder head, the cylinder head stays broke, or they pulled the head off and he lost his coolant. Other than that, I think he won just about every moto in 85. Yeah. So it was a great summer for Ron Lacheyne.
Yeah, Ron was dominant. The bike was really good. Our 125s from his era all the way through Mickey Diamond they were really fast. And And Ron, like you said earlier, he was kind of a class above everybody else at that time as well. So.
And his practice bikes didn't get many hours on them, Dave.
No, none of Ron's practice bikes got much time on them.
But actually, that leads me to the next question. Around this era, their practice bikes were full race bikes or full works bikes?
As much as possible.
Yeah, as much as possible?
Yeah. We did a pretty good job, as much as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, there was an era where we didn't have enough stuff, so there were some differences, but that's problematic. They're not used to it. They're not putting the time on the same thing they're racing, so we tried to improve that.